So here's the story of black people in America, basically. That at first, 1619 was when the first ones were brought over. Then there were even some free Africans for a long time with all the rights of white men, right? At least nominally. But by the 1700s, the late 1700s or thereabout, they started getting their rights taken away from them. Even the freed ones, no right to own land, no right to vote, no right to own slaves. You know, that can be called a right. Then, throughout slavery, there's this culture of, as Douglas depicts in his novel, uh, not knowing your family, for one, of taking pride often in your master, for two, and of varying degrees of cruelty for both understandable and, or for both, you know, morally, for both reasons of the slave being at fault, so to speak, and for them doing nothing, uh, or even just for show, cruelty for show to stop people from misbehaving in the future. Misbehaving. That's a catchy song. Then there were slave revolts. You had like uh, Nat Turner. I was thinking Nat King Cole, but that's a different guy. There's slave revolts throughout like the 1800s because shit sucked. There were abolitionists. Abolitionists were different from the anti-slavery crowd because there was different ways of ramping it down, perceived, like how there's different crowds with climate change nowadays. Um, so then what happens? There's this sort of battle between the states over slavery, and to an extent, it lasts 20 years even before the Civil War because it's like bloody Kansas, stuff like that. Then the Civil War happens. There's a lot of bad will from like the Irish toward Lincoln in the North for them being drafted. It's the usual class conflicts, right? And these class conflicts will figure both in the North and the South for why people don't care about black people. And the Civil War ends. At first, Lincoln isn't entirely against slavery. At first, well, he's definitely against slavery, but from a pragmatic viewpoint, as far as his thinking conditionally goes, he values much more keeping the Union together. Okay, so then after that, what happens? Civil War ends. Black people are freed. Certain amendments are made, but Andrew Johnson is against a lot of them. And there's kind of a wave that happens. But like in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, the fear crests somewhere. The wave crests somewhere and stops suddenly. Only a bit of progress is made. And a lot of that progress, like the Freedmen's Bureau, this free land here in around Georgia, South Carolina, a lot of acreage is taken back away from black people. And this whole sort of situation, there's already free black people. There's already black people who pass white to certain different degrees, and they're usually higher class or usually more part of polite society and put import into that. And there's going to be this weird dynamic on what cultures, like drunkenness and sort of practical jokes, I guess, or just vulgarity and open marriages would carry on from slavery, from the constraints of slavery, where that was all they could do, so. And some people must have participated in it, some people not. Like Douglass says, he didn't see participating in it as valuable. He said, it's the only thing upholding the institution of slavery is the December, the Christmas and the New Year's, where the slaveholders get the slaves to be tired of freedom. And so then there's these conflicts Douglass has with religion, right? So he sees it at first as instrumentally valuable to teach other slaves through the guise of a religious group, possibly. Because how could he really believe in God, But then when around the company of abolitionists, he decides that's the OG, that's the optimal God or whatever. But anyway, so he escapes after teaching himself and all this stuff, and after standing up for himself. So standing up for himself seems like something kind of vital, because someone else in his situation could have been just as wanting to escape, but not as courageous. It kind of means courage. That other person could have died being beaten by the slaveholder. So he escapes to the north and makes a living. And he talks about the struggles of being a free man, right, versus a slave, and how the personal and national economy, his economy, the economy of the people, is implicated in both slavery and non-slavery. And he sees how the North is just much more advanced. And some of this, I suppose, has to be a byproduct of the Puritans, but I cannot say too much about that. I don't know how many abolitionists were Puritans. Okay, I should section out this video. Anyway, so then, what happens after Douglass? Well, first after the Civil War, 65 to 41, there are these laws. These are black codes, which are part of the justice system disenfranchisement of black people to keep a steady labor force with no reasonable negotiating power whatsoever. Either they sign a contract or they get sort of hit with the you're just standing around not working and you're black charge, right? That's a Cliff Notes version, of course. A byproduct of this also is that black people are implicated as being criminals, right? Because you know, all of them are implicated as criminals just to make them work in mines to their deaths. So that lasts till 41, about an 80-year period. And the Great Migration happens. Well, you see, Reconstruction kind of ends by the 1900s, where by then a lot of things have happened. The Wilmington coup in North Carolina, stuff like that. 19. And this is the height of lynching. This is the height of racial animosity, both in the North and the South, because there's this criminal perception and there's also this economic competition conception. And so, what is the response to this lynching? The response to this, by the height of it, around the airing of Birth of a Nation by Woodrow Wilson, which is protested by this one black leader, I forget his name, who had disagreements with other black leaders, who talked personally to Woodrow Wilson, who called him rude, disrespectful. Woodrow Wilson called him that. And so, with the height of lynching in the post-war period, and in the period of the first blockbuster, which is like racist as shit and really bad, and Lillian Gish is the only good part of the movie. With that, they find that it is very imperative upon them to move the fuck out of the South. So from 1916 to 1970, they do so due to a combination of things, likely the war that leads to lower white participation in industry and black people move up to, make a living. Then the Harlem Renaissance, then the Great Depression, then in the Great Depression, which probably led to really bad prison things for kind of, justifying a Nazi-like sort of economic improvement or economic maintenance. Then World War II happened, and a similar thing with low white participation. Then, post-World War II, there was the GI Bill. And GI loans meant you could go to college, you could buy a home in the suburbs unless you're black, along with redlining, which was the highway system. The highway system, along with a lot of the concomitant industry, affected disproportionately black people than other ethnicities like Jewish people and Italians, but that is less lasting because redlining is a term for the highways being built and ruining neighborhoods, causing a lot of homelessness, and then a lot of people moving out, a underfunded city, therefore unemployment. Unemployment, which was caused in many ways by the systematic firing of black people, at least in Detroit, after World War II, because we don't need black people, we can hire white people. Um, so that's the suburbanization of America, and this is a high crime period, which is also related to a high lead time. There's a Veritasium video about that I just watched. High lead in gasoline and also in paint leads to higher crime. The rates for sort of lead in cars and child sort of exposure to lead and like child violence or violence of that child when they grow up to like around 18, prime crime ages, prime crime times is much higher. But yes, and so this suburbanization happens, it's called white flight, and it happens probably both because it's just, an Americana thing, and also because of racial perceptions and perceptions that black people are entirely at fault for their position, um, which already in 1967 you have the Detroit riots. 50 people die in them, a lot of property damage, but LBJ does this sort of investigation into them, and he finds that it's entirely an apartheid society in Detroit. That there's this time of the month that comes around when the quotas are due, and so you can be stopped for anything. You can stop and find. So it's totally unfair. It's total colonialism over the black population to the implicit benefit of the white population. Total police violence, police escalation, just police savagery. Now, this is also a high crime period in America. So, to an extent, some police, a lot of them coming home from Vietnam, they feel like they're in a war zone. Um, at least in San Francisco, I saw this story about this former Vietnam vet who was stationed in this forest park or something like that. Something different from that. I believe Forest Park is a place around Chicago. But so he talks about having this round where there had been a pipe bombed precinct about like a couple months ago or something. And so he was told to patrol the station. There were chain link fences put around the station and to patrol the station because all around it was forest. And so they were they perceived themselves as in a war zone. This was a time of high radicalism. And a lot of the Detroit riot was perceived as communist radicals, but then it was found that that wasn't the case. What the case was just people tired of dealing with bullshit and saying if we don't act, basically it's a bad metaphor, but in a sociological sense, we're going to be strangled, we're going to be castrated, we're going to be just, if we don't act now, we'll never act, in a sense. Think the slave who's trying to escape. It's a sense of that. It's a sense of not being able to escape your position, perhaps, and saying what property, this property that doesn't even, this property, it's leaky property, full of lead, full of rats, full of disease, full of just, like no heating, no nothing. Why do I value this? I'm gonna burn this down in protest of it, you know? And you could say that's justified or that's unjustified or that makes their point or it doesn't make their point, but it's it's anger. It's something that you can't quite rationalize, that you can't quite argue against, possibly, because once it gets to that point, you've you're clearly in the wrong. If you're saying they're in the wrong, sure, but you're in the wrong too, because you've turned your head to the point that these practices have persisted, and you're just asking, like, the world is unfair. You're just saying the world is unfair, just deal with it. Racism exists, just deal with it. Just like come off better, come off less black. Just try to like paint your skin white. Island after island. Um, so you have those police violence. I wrote these things down actually somewhere. Uh, Wait, did I write that in my essay? Oh well, it was a combination of issues I can remember. Police violence, property inadequacy, uh, the refusal of loans, the refusal to buy houses outside of Detroit. Because probably before this, all the housing in Detroit fucking sucks, right? There's slums and shit, and there's probably not just black people living in slums, but, you know, black people are the only ones not allowed to move out. Or else you just, like, decide, like, I guess I'm gonna become homeless, which is a whole nother fucking Oh, it's so complex. Um, yeah, I really need to section out this video. Really need to. There's police violence, uh, property, schooling, the inequality there, loans, business, employment, uh, okay, so then what about when this ends? Well, it ends in 1970, the Great Migration. That's what Google said. And ever since then, a kind of flow has happened back to the South. Suburbanization has continued, and black suburbanization began sometime probably after housing discrimination was made illegal, but probably a bit more after that. I don't know the times. But it's especially common in like Atlanta where there's a lot of sprawl, like what I fucking say. Front row, he lives in a suburb, Waka Flocka, Rockdale, or something. In the Dale. Um, so then there's, throughout this, starting in the 1895, the first ragtime song is made. Then it's jazz. Then, well, it's blues before jazz, but then, and also gospel, but then it's soul and rock, then disco and funk, then it's rap, then it's house, and it's modern R&B, stuff like that. And this is like the music of the culture. There's like sports, stuff like this, which is what very visible black celebrities mostly get famous in. You know, you have Oprah, Tiger Woods in golf, you have Thomas Sowell, you have a lot of black intellectuals, right? Um, but much more white representation than black representation. You know, Denzel Washington. Good actor. I prefer Don Cheadle. Don Cheadle is much more. I like how he looks. He looks very honest, or like he looks very earnest. Um, and so over time, um, especially in the 2000s, I feel like black music becomes more popular. In the 90s too, kind of. And nowadays, rap is like the most popular genre of music. So what does that say? That says that, well, I guess black music has been the most popular music for a long time, but black music by black people nowadays is a lot of the most popular music. And so that means something. Um, so that's kind of the story. A lot of riots, a lot of police violence. Oh, and then finally, gangs sprang up somewhat as honor culture, somewhat as protection from police violence, somewhat as a byproduct of unemployment. Anywhere where there's high unemployment, there's going to be high crime. It's just, what are you going to do? Like, beg? So, these gangs, I watched one video about it. It was about this Philadelphia gang. It was from the same video of the Vietnam vet who became a cop in San Francisco. Punch, boom, punch, punch, boom, punch. It had this kind of like beat throughout it. And like, yeah, it reminded me a lot of like modern like hood movies. It reminded me of it because it's not too different. It's just kind of the slang and the looks of like the surroundings and the particular economy of the gang. Like, I don't feel like drug culture was that big in like, okay, in the 60s of course, but drug culture has gotten bigger and bigger most likely. And this is also alongside uh, Malcolm X and his sort of self defense ideology. So some of these gangs rose as, you know, defense against, you know, police violence. Some of it is honor culture, and some of it is um, just unemployment, having nothing to do. Um, and as I said, crime was high in the 60s, 70s, likely, but not certainly because of lead in cars and gasoline, lead in paint, which leads to multiple disabilities, with mood disorders, educational disorders. Um, so this urbanization of black people also leads to a different sort of racism and environmental racism with highways, with cars, with lead paint, with certain industries being closer, more likely, and in the wind direction of black neighborhoods. This is a story, especially on the coast of Texas. Um, and then there's also stories, of course, in the South. Like there's one in South Carolina that Bernie Sanders had a sort of publicity thing in this case of like the water, how it wasn't up to par. So much shit is wrong. Fuck. But the crime peaked in the 90s and 80s and the 90s, but it's declined ever since the 90s. We've had a sort of peak lately, and some people are like, why is there a peak? But it's because of unemployment. Like, I mean, I guess you have your stimulus benefit checks, but we don't know how many people have gotten those. We don't know how many people are eligible. How do you become eligible? This isn't an argument I'm making. I don't have evidence for this. But and unemployment itself is enough to kind of make you like, sort of like, what the fuck am I doing, right? So this is basically the story. And this is postscript. So what are the ideologies? This is just what happened to black people, but what do black people think? Um, well, there's sort of a few main veins. There's the Marcus Garvey and Nation of Islam take, which is kind of black nationalist, black supremacy, black separatist, which is kind of for pride in black skin. Uh, it's kind of anti-intellectual in a way, kind of correlated with Islam. Marcus Garvey himself was Jamaican. Um, this might also correlate, probably not actually, with Rastafarianism. Black culture is very complex. It's very intercrossing. A lot of black people in America are African from Africa, like from recent memory. A lot of people are African American. A lot of people are West Indian, right? A lot of people are Afro Latino, um, or whatever that's called. Then there's black radicals who would be more like a W.E.B. Du Bois or a Fred Hampton or a Malcolm X. Malcolm X was at first kind of like a Marcus Garvey guy, but then he converted to Islam and decided, nah, I think all races are equal. Um, there was a sort of non-violence versus violence thing, which was MLK versus uh, Malcolm X. And there was also politeness versus impoliteness, which was a lot of people disagreed with, like the Black Panthers. But the Black Panthers themselves had a food program and a lot of, you know, nonviolent, community service programs, which helped a lot of people. Um, so the aspect of radicalism in the 60s, you have to be able to separate just the lunatics like the Georgetown massacre or whatever, the one in Guyana, terrible, fucking terrible. Um, from like the Black Panthers who were all around pretty good. Um, Cults. You could talk about this forever, but I'm trying to simplify it. Then there's the pragmatist viewpoint. So these three main viewpoints, which are sort of sort of black nationalist, pragmatist, and radical, And radical itself is sort of for for equality. Pragmatist is for sort of having dignity, but you know, just acting in a way that's moral, but not acting in a way that really gets you what you need. Not cutting corners, not doing anything that would upset anyone, right? So you could say basically the radicals are left, the pragmatists are center, and then the oh, I actually did that right on the camera. That's good. Then the uh, black nationalists are right wing, like Marcus Garvey. Um, then how does this link with white immigrant feeling? Well, the attitude of black people towards white people is you could see it as, there could have been class solidarity, but a lot of that instead became these people are taking our jobs away. These people are worse than us. These people are being imported by rich people to lower wages, right? And so I have, let's see, perception of the culture. Um, that was bad. Crime, stuff like that, but also certain role models, like jazz and stuff like that, and civil rights leaders who are given this prestige. You know, I have a dream that everybody is viewed by the not by the contents, the color of their skin, but the contents of their character. His perceptions of actions. Um, which is profiling. How white people over time don't just judge black people as bad, but also prejudge them as bad. Then there's perceptions of groupings, which is how people don't just perceive them as bad, don't just prejudge them as bad, but systematize a vilification of a whole race of people. Um, then there's this is called adaptation of the culture. This is what black people are doing themselves. So first, there's through left, middle, and right, left, center, and right, an attempt to make role models for black people from black people because what are you going to listen to a white person who says like, oh, if you do it like this you can do it fine, I don't have any difficulties because I'm white. um, there's adaptation of actions. This is what these philosophies do to you, the sort of attitude of pragmatism it creates, which can be seen probably across left, center, and right, because the left says we need to be equal, or else, but that's kind of the least pragmatic. The center says we need to have dignity. We can't upset anyone. That's pragmatic in a way. And the right says we'll never make peace with Whitey. Fuck Whitey, right? Which is also pragmatic. Um, and so the way you learn to act changes the way you think. Then there's adaptations of groupings, which are gangs and stuff like that. Though gangs, you could also talk about, there's plenty of other stuff than gangs. There's also civil rights groups, there's music scenes, there's uh, sports. I don't know. This sounds very. There's I don't know, cultures with like cooking. There's cultures of I don't know, playing cards, having jokes, shit like that, shooting the shit. Um, I don't know much about subcultures of black people. I'll confess. I know I don't know about like the black country clubs. How do you do? But I think this is perceived as probably like you hear often on Fox News, like that's the reason black people don't advance because it's considered uncool to be smart. Which I mean, I don't know. It's possible that you could reason um, to be smart is to survive. So then, if you think of to be smart as to advance, that's sort of not smart because it's not pragmatic because it's assuming that you can like make it, you can get through college, you can get a job. And it's also sort of something you have to focus on, which is hard to focus on when there's like, and this is peculiar to like Chicago, of course, and like high crime areas, but it's hard to focus on like your studies and like your passions when there's people dying in the streets. Kind of scarring if you remember that those are friends and relatives that die. Which people don't remember. They use it as often a cynical sort of, they kill their own, stuff like that, which is like a view of this suicidal, a suicidal view of black people. Like that they all want to like kill each other, which is dumb. Um, but anyway, then there's transformations of the culture. This is how it's dealt with appropriation and stuff like that, and with um, you know dissenting black voices and how you have to listen. You can't pick and choose if like if one black person has like a certain perspective on things, you have to listen to an extent because at the very least it has more sort of perspective actually from blackness than like a white person would have, right? So there's a certain resource of just authenticity that makes any black voice have a certain value that white voices just don't have. And this could be hard to understand. Um, I can't say I fully understand it. Then there's transformations of actions. This is like transformations of actions. I just have it as movement of African Americans toward the north and towards cities, but then it could be also suburbanization. So I just say migration and migration and education maybe is a good way to say it. And then probably A is wait. No. Then I is the Great Migration 24 no 16 to 70 and urbanization. And 2 is suburbanization. And 3 is like HBCUs, basically, and maybe trade HBCUs and black businesses. But I can be too kind of comprehensive. So that's transformations of actions, how you learn to adapt, how you learn, oh, I can't work with white people. I can work and learn with black people, because then, you know, in that financial racket, nobody's gonna call me the N word or shit like that. Nobody's gonna like laugh me out of the bank. Then there's transformations of groupings, which is, let's see, sort of resilience and the attitudes black people have towards each other, which are sometimes sort of toxic, sometimes, you know, emotionality is less valued than sort of durability and stuff like that. So, yeah. That's the end of the video. I'm going to timestamp this.